Okay, well, good evening and welcome, everybody. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Rick Pereira. I'm a member of Western Connecticut DSA. I'm here with Jason, Alex, Peter, and Victoria from Central Connecticut DSA. And I think I haven't seen all the attendees, but there's James and Naveen from Corner DSA. We're very excited about tonight's discussion. So Socialist Night School is brought to you by, as I've mentioned, the 3 Connecticut chapters of DSA, Quiet Corner, Central, and Western. It's a bi-weekly interactive and participatory deep dive into all sorts of subjects related to building a more equitable world through the study of socialist principles. Tonight's subject is worker-owned cooperatives. The official definition of a cooperative is an autonomous association of persons united voluntarily to meet their common economic, social, and cultural needs and aspirations through a jointly owned and democratically controlled enterprise. I'll drop a link to a description from the International Cooperative Alliance in the chat. So before I get too deeply into what a cooperative is and why cooperatives are relevant, we have very special guests to help us learn more about cooperatives, Professor Richard Wolff. So Professor Wolff is Professor of Economics Emeritus at UMass Amherst, where he taught economics from 1973 to 2008. He's also a visiting professor in graduate international affairs at the New School in New York City. And his weekly show, Economic Update with Richard D. Wolff, is syndicated on over 70 radio stations nationwide. And finally, a local connection. Besides having studied and taught at Yale, Professor Wolff lived in New Haven, Connecticut from 1964 through 2003, and he was politically active there throughout that time. In fact, he helped launch the New Haven Green Party. He ran for mayor as a Green Party candidate in 1985 and for Board of Aldermen in Ward 10 in 1987. So without further ado, I'll turn over the mic to Professor Wolff.
Thank you very much, Rick, and thank you all for participating. It's a pleasure to have at least some connection once again with Connecticut, where I lived most of my adult life. And I liked living there. I only left because of the possibilities to teach what I have to teach on a global scale, and to do that, New York City really is the place you have to be. So there are many ways to get at talking about worker co-ops. I'm going to choose 2 or 3. There are others in the hopes that they speak to you, that they are exciting to you as they have been to me, and perhaps even become a focus of your own thinking and your own work. A co-op is a unique way to organize an enterprise, a factory, an office, a store, doesn't really matter. Public, private, rural, urban, manufacturing, service, agriculture, worker co-ops, and that's the particular kind of co-op that I'm interested in, that I'm going to talk about, have existed for thousands of years. This is not a new idea. There's plenty of experience, concrete experience, in the past and in the present, where people have organized their workplaces as worker co-ops. Here is a rough description of how a worker co-op operates. It begins by understanding the workplace as a community, parallel to the community where you reside, where you live. You live in a residential community, and then you go to work in a enterprise community or a workplace community. And the idea of worker co-ops is to organize the workplace community democratically. And here's what that means. Everybody involved in an enterprise, no matter what he or she does, you get 1 vote, and everybody gets an equal 1 vote. And then the basic decisions of the enterprise are majority decided votes. So, for example, what the company or enterprise or workplace produces is decided democratically. What technology is used is decided democratically. The geographic location where production occurs is decided democratically. And what to do with the net product, what to do with the surplus or the profits, whatever you want to call it, that is also decided democratically. What this means is, and I can't overstress what I'm about to say, what this means is that the workers have become collectively their own boss. There is no split between one group of people who are the employer and another group of people who are the employee. Let me drive home the importance of this point historically. One of the oldest and longest lasting organizations of the workplace has a name we call slavery. In that arrangement, a small minority of people are the owners/masters, and a large majority of the people are slaves. The owner-masters make all of those key decisions. They decide what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the output. They can distribute some back to the slaves, which is typically a smart thing to do, since otherwise the slave won't be there tomorrow. But all the basic enterprise decisions are made by a minority that is in no way accountable to the majority. Another major system is called feudalism. In that you once again have a small minority. In Europe, they were called lords, and a large majority, and they were called serfs. And once again, the very small minority of lords made all the key decisions about what happened in the workplace, called the feudal manor. The lords decided what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the net output. Now we come to the next system, capitalism, the one we live in. On the one hand, it is not like slavery and feudalism. For example, nobody can own anybody else. So clearly there's a difference between capitalism and slavery. And likewise, it's not a kind of personal relationship between lord and serf, the way it is in feudalism, that binds a worker to the employer. We don't have a ceremony, for example, where we, the workers, swear loyalty and obedience to a lord. The relationship between an employer and an employee is different. It's a contractual, voluntarily entered into quid pro quo exchange. The employer gives you money, a wage, and you give the employer the use of your brains and your muscles 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. That's the deal. And once you've entered into that contractual relationship, once you cross the threshold into the workplace, there is no democracy. You are told by the employer what to do, where to do it, what tools to use, what raw materials to work on, how to do it, when to do it, every detail. You are told what to do. You then pour your brains and your muscle into the job of producing whatever the good or service is that the employer decides. And at the end of the day, a very interesting thing happens. You go home, you leave behind the fruits of your labor, which belong to the employer exactly on the instant that you have finished producing them. You go home to your TV and your pizza, and then you come back the next day to do it again. The employer has all the power. The employer decides what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits all of you as workers have helped to produce. The capitalist workplace is the opposite of democracy. Every time you hear, as you have in recent days, given all of the hoopla of Mr. Trump and the election, you hear this country referred to, quote unquote, as a democracy. Think with me for a minute. The workplace is where adults spend most of their lives. 5 out of 7 days, the best hours of the day, 8 hours at the workplace, another hour getting to it and recovering from it. That's where we are. And in a democratic society, the workplace would have been the first place to install democracy. However, in the history of the United States, democracy was never installed in our workplaces, and it does not exist there now, with the exception of a few worker co-ops that do exist in the United States. And perhaps during the question period, we can talk, and I'd be glad to describe for you the worker co-ops that exist in the United States today, and there are many, and that exist in other parts of the world where they are more than many. They are very widespread. Okay, let's turn to the worker co-op then as what it is. Economic democracy. It's about bringing democracy into the workplace. It is a remarkable thing about modern so-called capitalist societies that when they speak about democracy, they exclude the workplace. Democracy is about voting based on where you live, not where you work. It's about your relationship to the political authorities in your life, but not to the economic authorities that wield enormous power over you. How you spend your workday, what the fruits of it are, how you develop as a working person, what kind of impact it has on you, and ultimately, whether you have a job and income or you don't, all of that is decided by a small, unaccountable minority, the employer. Maybe the person who started the company, maybe the person who inherited the company from his or her parents, maybe the major shareholders who bought shares in the company, or the board of directors that are elected by the major shareholders. Whoever they are, they're a tiny minority that wields unaccountable, unrepresentative power over a majority. That is literally the definition of the opposite of democracy. It is possible to imagine that the only choices that we have about organizing the workplace, where we spend the bulk of our adult lives, it is possible to imagine that the choice is slavery or feudalism or capitalism or maybe individual self-employment. But the point of a story or an analysis about worker co-ops is to make it crystal clear to everyone that there's a bigger, wider range of choice than that. Do not accept people who act as though the worker co-op organization of the workplace doesn't exist or couldn't work or is, a utopian fantasy. All of that is, to use a technical term, bullshit. Worker co-ops have existed for thousands of years. They exist now. There's nothing utopian, nothing magical, nothing impossible, nothing extraordinary. Don't make the mistake that because you live in a society which keeps information about these things from you, that therefore they don't exist. That would be like a little 2-year-old frightened by a doggy putting his or her hands in front of their eyes and hoping that the doggy, because they can't see it, isn't there anymore. When you get a little older, you realize the dog is still there. It's just you don't see it anymore, but you will pretty soon. All right, let me talk about another way to get at what a worker co-op is. And this one is designed particularly for people who take seriously the concept of socialism, which obviously the DSA does, and which is part of the reason it is a pleasure and an honor for me to speak with the DSA, because I want to help build socialism. Just in case any of you were wondering, let me put my cards right on the table. That's why I'm here. It's true, the enormous fee that you're paying me would otherwise, of course, have brought me, but the truth is, it's solidarity that brings me, nothing else. Okay, where does a worker co-op fit into socialism? I'm going to go back to the leading intellectual of the 19th century who brought socialism to us. Not the only one, but the one whose name is attached to the most developed tradition, Karl Marx. Okay? Marx's insight was a profound one, that capitalism was not the end of the universe. It wasn't the end of history. It was just another phase that, like every other system before it, it is born, it evolves and changes over time, and then it dies. That's what happened to feudalism. That's what happened to slavery. That's what happened to primitive tribal economics. You name it, born, evolved, and died. If you understand that, then a logical conclusion follows. Capitalism clearly was born 17th, 18th century in England, and then spread all over the world. And over the last 3 centuries, capitalism has clearly evolved and changed, which means that the next major phase of capitalism is its death. I want to let that sink in. I might mention parenthetically that for the first time in my life, I've been an economics professor all my life. For the first time in my life, I'm beginning to wonder whether the death of capitalism is what I'm living through. But be that as it may, when Marx and Engels, and then later Lenin and Gramsci and all the others, Rosa Luxemburg and the whole collection, as they began to puzzle out in the 19th and 20th century how you could get beyond capitalism to a new and different way of organizing both the workplace and society as a whole, they found themselves debating not so much what that future society would look like, because predicting the future is a iffy proposition. always. And they shifted their focus on the more immediate question. How do we get beyond capitalism? We have to figure that out. Otherwise, imagining what that future looked like becomes kind of idle speculation. So the conversation already in the 19th century, and then again in the 20th, came to be focused on how. How do we get beyond capitalism? And slowly a consensus emerged, particularly in the 19th century, but it was carried through most of the 20th as well. And the consensus went something like this. The capitalists control, because that's how capitalism works, the means of production. They own the factories. They own the stocks of raw materials. They own the machinery. They own the money. And with those things, they have enormous influence over the government, over the culture. They are therefore very powerful. How are we going to get beyond the capitalism when they have so much power to keep it in place? And the consensus answer was, we have the people. Because after all, the employer class, the capitalists, are small in number. They are a very small minority of the population. We have the majority. We speak to, we speak for, we are ourselves employees. And in Western society, we have achieved by the 19th century, if not universal suffrage, well, we're well on our way to universal suffrage. And if government is going to be elected by the people, one person, one vote, we have the majority. Therefore, how you get beyond capitalism becomes the strategic focus, and this is crucial, on the government. Literally on seizing, getting the government, which we can do with our numbers if we organize and we can win the votes, even if it looks like a hard slog. Think of John Ossoff. Think of Reverend Warnock. Long time, they won. And they won because they had the numbers. So the focus became the state. And then something happened that happens often in human history. Because the future socialist society was long away in the distance, the primary focus, getting beyond capitalism, became the dominant discussion. How do you capture the state, and how do you use the state to go beyond capitalism? And now, to make a long story short, here's where the consensus ended up. Number one, there's a debate. There are two ways to capture the state, to make the transition. Number one, revolution, insurrection, upheaval. The serious version of that Keystone Cop adventure some of you saw in Washington today. And the other way is the ballot. You win by elections. And the debate between those two starts in the 19th century and continues to the present moment. In 1917, socialism took a new step. Beyond thinking about how to go beyond capitalism, a bunch of folks actually did it. They had done it earlier in 1870 in the city of Paris. If you've never read about that, read about it. The people of Paris rose up in 1870 and established something called the Paris Commune. The workers took over. It only lasted a few months, but they did it. And Marx wrote all about it. And Lenin wrote all about it. And they drew important lessons which were then applied in Russia in 1917, when they not only rose up, but they took the state away from the capitalists. And then they did something remarkable. They said the state, now that we, the working class, the revolutionary socialists, have taken it over, and we've survived those early years, now the question is, what do we do with the state to go further, to go towards the socialism? That was always the goal. And then they made a decision that the state would either regulate the private enterprises of capitalists, forcing them to behave in ways that would be good for a future socialism, not for the reproduction of capitalism. Or don't do that. Don't regulate, because you can always see the enterprise escaping the regulation. Take it over. Dispossess the private capitalists so that the enterprises become state-run, state-owned, in order to make sure that they go those next steps. In 1921, Lenin in Russia, he's now the leader, makes a famous speech. And he makes in that speech the following remark. What we have in the Soviet Union now, remember the revolution was in 1917, and this is 1921. What we have in Russia now is state capitalism. His phrase. The state is controlled by the workers, by our Communist Party. But it's still, enterprises are run by small groups of employers. We control them, we regulate them, but it's still a small group. And even if they are state officials, it doesn't change the basic way the enterprise works. A tiny group of people making the decisions for a mass of employees. That's not socialism, Lenin explains. We've got to get to socialism. 7 or 8 years later, Lenin dies in 1923. 7 or 8 years later, Stalin takes over. Long story. And Stalin makes an interesting declaration. What we have in the Soviet Union, he says, is socialism. Socialism achieved. And what's the definition? When the state owns and operates, or at least tightly regulates an enterprise, you've got socialism. It's interesting. It's a definition of socialism that makes no mention whatsoever about the internal organization of the workplace. It seems as though socialism is about who owns the enterprise, not how it works. It seems as though the issue is, as it is in the United States, mostly posed in these days. Is it privately owned by citizens or owned by the government and operated by state officials? It's as if the discussion between capitalism and socialism is a matter of ownership. Is it private or is it state? I would like to argue for you and to ask you to think about whether that isn't, however understandable in terms of history, a terrible analytical mistake. In other words, there is no justification for discussing the difference between capitalism and socialism and how you go from the former to the latter. That abstracts from the question, are you going to democratize the enterprise or are you not? Is socialism really achieved when you've gotten rid of the private capitalist and replaced him with a state official? Or was Lenin right to call that state capitalism because you haven't changed the internal organization? Let me push this one step further. If you ever study slaveries, and there have been many in the history of the world, you will quickly discover that there were many slave enterprises where the master was a private citizen, alongside slave enterprises where the government or the state had its own slaves. But nobody has ever argued that you didn't have slavery anymore because there was state slavery alongside of private slavery. And the exact same applies to feudalism. Were the feudal lords private citizens? Yes, often. Did the feudal state have its own serfs? Was there state feudalism? You betcha. But nobody has argued that because you had a bit more state or private here or there, you didn't have feudalism anymore. Not at all, because you still had the lord-serf relationship. Well, guess what? The same thing applies to capitalism. There has always been, in all capitalist societies, a mixture of employers who were private citizens alongside an employer who was part of the state apparatus. The presence or absence of more or less state relative to private is an interesting question, but it has nothing to do with the transition from capitalism to socialism. You have every right to prefer private to state capitalism, or the other way around. I can have that conversation. There are pros and cons, but that's a separate matter. Socialism once was, as it can and I hope will be again, a proposal for a different way to organize our lives as human beings, individuals, and communities. And one of its hallmarks is a democracy not just where we reside and live and choose our mayors and our representatives and all of that. Democracy was never meant to be limited to politics. In fact, I would argue, if we had time, that the only way you'll ever get a genuine democracy politically is if it is sitting side by side with a genuine democracy in your economy. And the only way to get that is to substitute worker co-ops, democratized enterprises, for the hierarchical, top-down, undemocratic, capitalist way of organizing enterprises. And here's a bonus. Because socialism was identified so heavily for the last 100 years with the Soviet Union, or the People's Republic of China, or Cuba, or Vietnam, or all the rest that you're familiar with, many Americans particularly believe that somehow socialism is about what the government does. Notice again, they don't worry about what it is that they do. They worry about who is doing it. If it's an employer, it doesn't matter. That's the point of Marx's insight. But here's the bonus. The enemies of socialism have been training everybody to think of socialism as something from above, that the government does or does to you, or imposes on you, or organizes for you. The mass of people have not been trained in how to understand, let alone refute, a socialism that comes to them and says, this has got nothing to do with the government. Socialism in the 21st century is going to be very successful because what it advocates is a revolution at the base in your daily work life. You are no longer going to be the person without power, the person without participation in the running of an enterprise. In a worker co-op, everybody has two job descriptions: the particular task you do, but also your participation in running, in designing, in organizing the enterprise. You will have skills developed in a worker co-ops that were never interesting to the employer and never developed in a capitalist enterprise. You will have relationships with fellow workers that were never possible, never even imagined in a capitalist hierarchical system. We will be different people, and that's always been part of the dream of a socialist system. I think we're going to be very successful. The idea of worker co-ops has become very exciting. Bernie Sanders put it on his platform as something he's committed to. A couple of weeks ago, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, in a public interview, was asked what was she focusing on, and to my surprise, she said worker co-ops. The most successful worker co-op, let me conclude with this. I'll give you two examples, then I'll stop. The Mondragon Corporation, the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation. For all the details, just Google it and you can find out more than you want to know about. Started in 1956 by a Roman Catholic priest in the northern Spanish city, small city of Mondragon. It now has over 100,000 workers. It's the 7th largest corporation in all of Spain. It's a record of economic growth that is the envy of every capitalist enterprise in Spain, in Europe, anywhere. Over the last 70 years that it has existed, it has outcompeted literally dozens of capitalist corporations because the worker co-op proved more innovative, more productive, and more profitable. That's why it grew. Here are a few things that are true of the Mondragon Corporation. The highest paid person cannot get more than 8.5 times what the lowest paid person gets. That's a democratically decided range. A CEO of a large American corporation gets roughly 300 times what the lowest paid worker does. Mondragon doesn't have the extremes of inequality that are normal in capitalist societies. The supervisors at Mondragon are elected and keep their jobs or not, depending on whether the workers hire them. Let me say that again. The workers hire the supervisors, not the other way around. The second example is the province of Italy around the northern city of Bologna. It's called Emilia-Romagna. It's a part of Italy. For many decades, roughly 40%, 40, of the economy of Emilia-Romagna is worker co-ops. They have reproduced themselves. They live in a comfortable coexistence with capitalist enterprises. A professor of business at the Leeds University, that's in England, Leeds, England, a professor named Virginia Perrotin, French woman. She's a professor of business, and her research is to compare the productivity, the profitability, and the duration of similar enterprises where one is organized capitalistically and the other one as a worker co-op, in order to answer the question, which is the more productive, which is the kind of enterprise that lasts longer, and which is the more profitable. And you can guess why I'm bringing her up, because her research shows, all published, that the worker co-op is the better way to go. A socialism that puts the focus on a worker co-op is a new kind of socialism for which the mass of the American people are already sympathetic. Do not have an armature of hostility. Avoids having to defend Russia, China, or any of the real or imagined flaws in those systems. It's the future, I would argue. And it also speaks to the labor movement with a simple message. It's one thing for a union to fight and bargain with an employer. But you always know, even when you win, that that employer will be working from the day you win to undo whatever it is you won. You've got an adversary, and the system makes it so. Imagine how much better it would be if, instead of arguing with an adversary, you were talking to yourself. You'd get a better deal, and it would be more secure. Anyway, let me stop there. This is the amount of time that we agreed I would talk. I'd be more than happy to respond to any questions or elaborate on whatever it is that would be most interesting to you.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Wolff. That was fascinating and really succinct and clear description and contextualization of cooperatives within the socialist movement. So I'm just going to read through some of these questions that people have submitted for you. We've got quite a few. I'm not sure we're going to be able to get through all of them. But so first off, we have Fletcher who asked, would Professor Wolff's ideal economic system be market socialism? What do you think of David Schweikart's model as laid out in After Capitalism?
Yes, I am a Democrat with a small d, and I believe in it. And I would like it to be the deciding circumstance. Human beings have developed a multiple set of ways of distributing both resources and products. We have done it by, for example, having a leader of a community. And we give to the leader the authority, you distribute. I will make the bread, and she will make the shirts, and he will make the pots and pans, and then you, dear leader, you distribute them. Or we can have a council of elders do it. Or we can set up a set of criteria. You get more things if your family is large. You get fewer things if your family is small. Or we can have a peculiar system. Most of the history of the human race didn't do this, but we can have this peculiar system which is called market exchange, where I make something and then I bargain with you, and we agree on how many of whatever it is I make I give you in exchange for how many of whatever you make you give me. This too will accomplish distribution. What I make will be distributed to you in exchange for what you make getting distributed to me. Markets, in a word, are a mechanism of distribution. As a socialist, my view is I'm not going to argue it's the right way to go as opposed to all the others, or am I going to argue it's the wrong way to go? I think markets are a mechanism of distribution that has certain strengths and certain weaknesses, just like every other mechanism of distribution. And in a democratic society, we ought to put that up to the people to decide what mixture of alternative ways of distributing resources and products would we use? And with each one that we might use, a problem may arise. There may be, if I can borrow from Marx again, contradictions. That is, there may be something about a market that undermines the worker co-op. We wouldn't want that then. We would say, okay, well, we don't want to give up the worker co-op, so we're going to have to either abolish the market, use some other system, or to control the market in certain ways. Let me give you an example, because this happens with every system. Do we distribute everything by means of a market here in the United States? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. When you have Thanksgiving dinner, if your parents cook the turkey, they do not typically sell you a drumstick over dinner, do they? They don't. And if your mother or father reached you a drumstick and asked for $5, there'd be a problem at the dinner, wouldn't there? And somebody would start giving somebody else a lecture that we're a family, we love each other. We don't do that. I make the turkey because I love you all and I want to share it with you. Get a lecture about, if I may, the contradiction between love and markets. I always loved this example because not only does it apply inside the house, I'm a socialist. I think it applies outside too. So I don't want this argument. I'm not going to get drawn into that. It's not my concern. My focus is on the democratization of the workplace, and I will judge alternative ways of distribution, markets included, by whether they work, whether they reinforce or undermine this democratic workplace that is the priority for me as a socialist.
Thank you. So, second question is, what can franchise service workers such as McDonald's do to make their workplaces more democratic? Could franchises be organized as worker cooperatives?
Well, the second one is very easy to answer. There's absolutely no problem with a franchise being organized as a worker co-op. It's a question of whether the parent company is or isn't willing to sign a contract with a group of workers rather than an individual. By the way, this is the same problem worker co-ops have had with banks. Will a bank make a loan to a group, a co-op, or does it have to have an individual signatory? By the way this has worked out in the United States is that there are banks all over the United States that have in the past worked out arrangements to make loans to worker co-ops. And if you want to start a worker co-op, there are ways to find out who those banks are, so you don't waste your time with a bank that doesn't know how to do this, and you go to a bank that has experience. Since the banks have made those loans, since those loans have been perfectly appropriately paid back, there's no problem in getting that. You just have to know how to do it. By the way, there is an association of the existing, the hundreds, the thousands of existing worker co-ops in this country. There's an association of them. It's called the United States Federation of Worker Co-ops. And through that institution, which you can find on the internet, you can get loads of information. The Mondragon Corporation in Spain has its own university because it's so big. In that university, it's called the Mondragon University. They have courses, how to finance a worker co-op, how to start one, how to solve the interpersonal problems that are unique to a worker co-op because it's horizontal rather than the command structure of a vertically organized capitalist enterprise. None of this is stuff you're going to have to figure out all by your lonesome. This is an established alternative. The only irony is that socialists are less aware of worker co-ops than worker co-op activists are aware of socialism. And what we need to do is to bring these together so they mutually reinforce one another.
Yeah, thank you. I think, are we going to 8:30? I think.
I can go.
You're good until
Yep.
8:30? Awesome, thank you so much. Okay, so another question is similar. How can, for example, college towns that have been rocked by both the failed handling of the pandemic and dramatic reduction in student populations, how might college towns be able to use a worker cooperative development process to ensure future viability?
I didn't understand the last part of the question. How can worker co-ops use, could you just go over that?
Yeah, so Ray, this question is from Ray Moore. Like maybe Ray, you'd like to give some detail on that if you would like to unmute yourself.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, so the question is basically, with college towns, and I imagine, this is throughout the states, it's, they've been rocked by COVID and rocked by just the mishandling, such that like, it looks like the model for higher, for education in the country may be changing. They may move more towards automation, remote learning. And I was just curious if you had any thoughts on that and how worker cooperatives might interrupt this process if you see that as something that's happening.
Yeah, my answer to that really is extendable, if you like, to a whole host of situations. I'm going to come down fairly hard on the existing organization of colleges and universities, and I've spent my entire life in those institutions. That's what I've done, starting at Yale in Connecticut, in New Haven. And New Haven is probably more dependent on Yale than any other community in Connecticut is dependent on its higher education, if it has one. Because of the enormity of Yale, I really had to learn that there. Yale models itself after a capitalist corporation, which shouldn't surprise you, given that we're in the United States, and given that the Yale Corporation, by the way, that's its name. The entity that governs Yale calls itself the Yale Corporation, just so you should have no doubt about what their model really is. And on the Yale Corporation sit the heads of mostly corporations. How surprising. And they are very happy to make all the decisions. The last time I looked at Yale, the so-called Yale community runs about 17 or 18,000 people if you add up the students, the faculty, the staff, all of that. Okay, so a board that has maybe a dozen people on it makes the decisions for 18,000 people. Very typical large corporation. They do what's best in their view for this institution. And it should come as no surprise to you that what they think is best for the institution has a great deal to do with reproducing the internal structure, because they sit at the tippity top of that pyramid and they want to stay that way. They got onto that pyramid because it's set up like that, and that's the legacy they want to leave to others. So they make decisions based on a set of criteria and goals and objectives that would be radically different from how a university would operate if it were democratically organized. If the faculty and the staff and the students had genuine democratic power to work out solutions to whatever the problems are, whether that be a pandemic, whether that be a change in the organization of education, and so on. And my feeling is what you're seeing now all across the country is a grotesque failure of the system because it is organized in this capitalist way. Give you an example. a broad example. 5% of the private schools in America are now using distance learning. In other words, the students are not gathered in a physical place together. 64% of public schools are operating that way. So let me drive that home. Private schools, only 5% are doing distance learning. Public schools, 64%. That's just about money and capitalism. The people who send their kids to the private schools, the entities that are organized as capitalists, they find the ways to secure their income. And one of the ways you do that is to keep those kids coming, because you're not going to get the money from their parents if you don't. How do you do that? You commandeer space. If you don't have the space, and by space I mean a way for a teacher to have no more than 3 or 4 students in the room, social distancing, everybody wearing a mask, everything cleaned on a regular basis, so that you have the safety that can bring people together. Since education at a distance isn't really education pretty much anyway. Okay, what did the private schools do? They had the money, so they went around and they commandeered music halls, movie theaters, restaurants, all the kinds of things that couldn't function and that therefore were sitting on empty space. When that wouldn't work, they set up tents, heated tents, so that they could have classrooms where they before had recess, or before there was a lawn, or before there was an adjacent empty lot. They took the steps necessary. Now, in a public school, you could have done that, but you would have had to have money, and you would have had to have the political pressure to do this. But the public schools aren't set up like that. If they were, you might have had the teachers for their own interest as workers. I want to keep my job. I don't want to be unemployed. By the way, roughly 1 million American teachers, public school teachers, are now unemployed. 1 million. And I'm not even talking about the other 20 million that are currently receiving unemployment compensation, that include more than enough people to have public schools, 1 teacher for every 5 students in a commandeered place. We didn't do that over the summer. We could have. Then we could have started this last semester and restarted our education system. A collective democratic community working on higher education would not have let that happen. Instead, we have a top-down system replicating the capitalist model, in which a group of people at the top, who, by the way, can keep their jobs as administrators of the schools, even while the children and the teachers and the staff go on unemployment. This would not be the way any democratic worker co-op would ever operate.
Thank you. So our next question is kind of more theoretical. It's from Conrad, who is a member of YDSA. The progression you talked about in your earlier talk about the progression between from slavery to feudalism to capitalism is referred to as historical materialism. And to Conrad's understanding, there's some debate over the driving force behind that engine. And what's your opinion on that?
Yes, I only mentioned them as alternatives. I did not mention them as sequential. The debate, the old debate, has a sequence. Sort of the human history goes from this to slavery to feudalism to capitalism and then to socialism. This kind of it's called in philosophy a teleology. This kind of notion of a sequence with a predetermined ending is, for me, a religious way of thinking. It's the sociological parallel of imagining that we are born, we live, we die, and then we sit with the angels in heaven forever. For me, I read Marx very carefully. I taught Marx all my life. I don't see the sequence there. What I see is his discussing alternative ways. It can go in any which way direction. You can go from slavery to capitalism, from capitalism to feudalism, you name it, you can do that. It's an open-ended kind of thing. His reason to distinguish was to help people get out of the habit of thinking that the way it is now in the economy is the way it has always been, from which you then draw the corollary, it's the way it always will be. That is a dangerous way of thinking if what you want is to go beyond capitalism to something different. So what Marx was doing, as a philosopher would, was setting the groundwork to help people understand, look, here's how differently work has been organized. Don't be afraid of imagining how it could be different from the way it is now.
Awesome, thank you. So returning to cooperatives, how would you implement the worker co-op for state-owned institutions such as education, national telecommunications, energy, et cetera?
Well, basically, you would do it the same way for public institutions as you would do it for private institutions. Your job is to say, let me do it one way here. I'll do it two ways. One way, legally, you could make it a legal arrangement, the way the 13th Amendment of the US Constitution. The 13th Amendment says slavery is illegal. Whatever else you do in your enterprise, you cannot buy a human being. Or to put it another way, if you buy a human being and the human being gives you the middle finger and leaves, there's nothing you can do about it. You can't go to a court and say, I paid $umpteen for her or him, and therefore the court will throw you out of the room because there is no legal basis. Suppose we said nobody can hire another person on the grounds that that's an unacceptable, socially unacceptable arrangement, like slavery. Let me give you another example. You cannot sexually harass a person at your workplace. You cannot bargain a promotion for sexual access. If you do that, you are in violation of the law. You can be prosecuted, et cetera, et cetera. Well, we can also say that the only acceptable, socially acceptable organization of work, if a group of people are going to get together and start an enterprise, that's fine. But you can't have some of them be the employer and others the employee any more than you can have some of them be the master and others be the slave. That's not acceptable. That's how you would do that. Let me give you an example of another way of going about it, which is in fact the proposal and the political commitment made by the Labour Party in Great Britain when it was under the leadership of a socialist, namely Jeremy Corbyn. He's not the leader now, but he was until recently. Here was the commitment of the British Labour Party. If we win the election, they said, here's what we will do the first day that we become the new government of the UK. We will pass a law that gives workers in every enterprise in Britain a legal thing called the right of first refusal. Here's what it means. Any company in the United Kingdom can continue into the future the way it is now. The government will not bother you. But if you either propose to close your business or to sell it to another business or to move it out of the country or to convert it into a stock company by an initial public offering of shares, you can do all those things, but the law will require you to give your own workers first the right to buy your company. And you have to offer it to them. If they refuse, you can go ahead and do whatever it is you were planning to do. And when they proposed that, the conservatives, because they were stupid, didn't think they had thought it through. And the conservatives says, empty law, where would the workers get the money? At which point Jeremy Corbyn and his associate John McDonnell smiled and answered, because the government will give the workers a low interest loan to do exactly that. What was the point? They wanted to create in Britain a worker co-op sector of the economy. And this was the way they would do it. Every working group of workers would now have a real option. They wouldn't have to accept that the company closed, or that the company moved, or that the company was sold to another company that did whatever the hell they wanted with it. They could fight back. They could say, no, we have the right of first refusal. The government gives us that with the law, and we can apply for a loan. And what was the justification? You might like this. Americans usually do. Here's the argument. If you have a worker co-op sector, your people will have genuine freedom of choice. They will know what a capitalist enterprise is because they live in that. Their mother and father do that. Their brother, sister, and cousins work in a capitalist enterprise. They have too. But now, for the first time, if we have a worker co-op sector, they will be able to visit and see what a worker co-op is like. Over a picnic, they will be talking to their friends who work in worker co-ops and will tell them what the experience is. For the first time, you will have a genuinely informed electorate that can then make the decision democratically what mixture of capitalist hierarchical and what portion of worker co-op enterprises, so that young people can, for example, choose to work in one rather than another. Americans have no such freedom of choice. And the British were committed to give their people that freedom of choice by creating. Creating what? Creating in Britain what I earlier told you already exists in the Italian province of Emilia-Romagna, where they do have that freedom of choice for the Italian people there that does not exist. Nothing comparable exists, neither for the British nor for the Americans.
Thank you. Yeah, your answer reminded me of an interesting book that a lot of people here in Connecticut might be interested in reading, Banded Together by Jeremy Brecker, which was written in the 90s, I think, about his efforts to organize brass factory workers in the Central Valley of Connecticut, the Naugatuck Valley.
Right.
And imagine if the right of first refusal would have been available to them in the 1980s. You know, we would have had a lot more. We would have kept a lot more jobs.
Now, let me give you an example that expands that. And by the way, it could have and should have been done by the state of Connecticut. It has the funds for it. It could have been done. Should have been done. By the way, these are loans, which mean that the worker co-op pays it back. So this is money that the government will recover over time, while doing a wonderful thing for these workers and for the whole population to see what this kind of work experience means in a person's life. And of course, if Yale were not the conservative, blind, rich place, by the way, I'm a graduate of the place, so I'm allowed to say these things. I'm joking. I'm allowed, whether I did it or not, but I did in fact go to school there and I taught there. But it is an intellectual desert. It was when I was there, and nothing but cactus has grown there ever since either. But Yale could have done it. It prides itself on innovative solutions that it could have offered to its community. It just didn't think of that one. Surprise, surprise. So it didn't do it either. The federal government could do it. The state government could do it. Yale could have done it. The reason they didn't do it is because it's a capitalist country in the United States, and the blindness and deafness and dumbness about these alternatives is a carefully cultivated quality.
Yeah. So another quick question. How would worker co-ops work for medical professionals? Do you know of any examples of healthcare worker cooperatives?
Yes, they're quite common all around the world. It's been one of those areas that co-ops kind of naturally form, and there's a reason for it. Doctors, the way you train doctors is, kind of, we're all doctors. What distinguishes us are our different specialties. I'm a surgeon, you're a dentist, he's an epidemiologist. So we're all kind of professionals. We all have had this kind of training. So to get together and do it in a kind of democratic way is easier than you get in other kinds of work. The problem usually comes with the other rankings, because in the capitalist organization, hierarchy is very important. If you've ever been to a hospital, for example, the hierarchy is stupefying. I worked in a hospital when my poor parents decided as a young person that I should investigate becoming a doctor. They made the terrible mistake of arranging for me to spend the summer working in a hospital, which cured me of any interest whatsoever in becoming a doctor. But one of the things I learned the first day I was there, I made the terrible mistake of grabbing the outfit that I was to wear in the hospital, which was this simple shirt, the simple pants, and they were green. And I put them on and I went around the hospital doing what I was asked to do until a very angry doctor stopped me, because I was very young. I was in high school. He said, "What are you doing with that outfit?" I looked at him. I said, "What's wrong?" "You're not a doctor." Congratulations, I'm 16. It would have been odd if I'd been a doctor. "Well, you can't wear green." That's when I learned the ranks were organized by color. This is the mentality of a kindergarten. Yeah, the blue is the big shot, the orange is the in between, and the green is the peon. And if you sweep something, I suppose you're supposed to stand around just in your underwear or something like that. I mean, that's where the problem arises. Can you democratize and overcome the sedimented rankings that capitalism is so committed to reproducing over time?
All right, so unfortunately we're not going to be able to get through all of these questions, but I'll ask maybe another couple. Let's see. Dylan Colborn says that he loved your latest book and wrote an essay on it in his writing class. I've often heard you and Dr. Fraud talk about the Mondragon Corporation and its appliance co-op Fagor in particular. I'm curious how you feel about the collapse of Fagor and the criticisms of Mondragon by Chomsky and Vincent Navarro. It's been pointed out that there are increasing numbers of non-owner workers and that Mondragon uses exploited South American labor. It's said that there has been there's become a tier system, not unlike traditional capitalist management. How can we stop these new structures from ultimately emulating the capitalist model?
There are several questions sort of wrapped up here. Let me start. It is correct that the Mondragon Corporation makes partners, if you like, equal workers of only about last time I looked, 60 or 70,000 of the more than 110 or 120,000 workers that are part of it. So there's already a ranking difference between the full partner Mondragon member and these others. But it's nothing like a capitalist corporation, because the full partners are 60 or 70,000. Most corporations that have 100,000 workers, the board of directors has got 15 people on it, and they make all the decisions. So there's nothing comparable here. They would have to go a very, very much further down that road before you could kind of say that they were like a capitalist corporation, number one. Number two, the reason that they have a sizable group of workers that are employees, that are not full participant, equal decision makers, as they want them to be, that's what they say anyway, is they expanded. In order to hold on to their markets, they expanded and set up enterprises in a variety of other countries, not only in Europe, but in other parts of the world, in China and Africa and so on. And here's the story, because I went there, I asked these questions. Here's what they told me. In many of these places, the workers had never heard of any of this, did not want to do any of this, had no cultural, educational background preparing them for, or giving them an appetite for decision-making participation. They wanted to come to work at 8 o'clock, do their job, go home at 5 o'clock, and they wanted nothing else to do with this enterprise. It was just a way of earning their living. They tell me that they think over time they can find the individuals to make the partners who will then bring their fellow local people into this process. But they stress that it took them decades in Spain, where this started, to build the culture, and it's going to take them time as well. But they claim, and I have no reason to doubt them, that they are 100% committed to bringing those workers who came later onto the full partnership that the other 60 to 70,000 already have. What was the other part of the question? I was working on that.
Maybe it was the initial part about the how you feel about the collapse of Fagor.
Yes, Fagor, F-A-G-O-R, was a very successful, Mondragon Corporation, let me take a step back, is actually, think of it like a holding company. It's a collection of about 200 specific worker co-ops, some in manufacturing, some in services, some in agriculture. For example, the largest supermarket, food supermarket chain in Spain is part of the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation. Fagor was a manufacturing co-op that produced home appliances, washing machines, dishwashers, things like that. And what really hurt them was what happened in the crash of 2008, what is called in this country the subprime mortgage crash of capitalism in 2008. That was also very devastating in Europe. And for a while, nobody built houses, nobody bought houses, and the demand for home appliances literally collapsed. And what happened was the workers of Fagor suddenly could not continue because nobody would buy the machines. They made very good machines, they had a good business, it collapsed. This happened to, by the way, producers of capitalist producers of appliances. But here were the key differences. Because Fagor was part of Mondragon, there was a commitment of Mondragon to place the workers that could not continue at Fagor in one of the other co-ops, and many of them were accommodated that way. The second thing that was done, which is really a power of co-op, was that the workers got together and they made a decision. They were not going to handle the fact that half of them were not necessary anymore by firing half of the people there. That's what would have happened and did happen in capitalist corporations. They decided democratically, out of their solidarity with one another, that instead of firing half the people and keeping the other ones working full-time, everybody would work half-time. Nobody would lose a job. Everybody would take a hit on their income, but it would be a collective, and it would be softened by whatever jobs in other co-ops within Mondragon they could place people. So it's a very different way of handling a crisis. But a worker co-op is as vulnerable to external problems as any other kind of business, but they would handle it differently.
Thank you, Richard. I think that'll be the last question. There's some stuff that I'd like to mention, kind of to bring it back to Connecticut. And so, yeah, we really appreciate all your insights and your answers to all of our questions.
Yeah, let me just, if I could, before I sign off, if anybody watching or listening is interested, we maintain a number of places where you can go and find out more information. 2 websites. The first one is called democracyatwork.info. So democracy at work is all one word, .info. The second one is my own, R.D. Wolff. That's spelled RDWOL, 2 Fs, rdwolff.com. We produce and distribute a weekly radio and television program. It's called Economic Update. It's broadcast on about 100 radio stations across the country, and it goes out through several television networks into about 55 million homes. It's every week for a half an hour, an analysis of what's going on in the economy. If you're interested in this kind of approach, go find it. It's also up on YouTube, and we have a very elaborate Facebook, Instagram, Twitter presence. And I just invite you, if you want to pursue it, all of those are available.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Professor Wolff.
Okay, and my appreciation again, I am very heartened by the growth of DSA in this country at this time. Very, very important. And for those of us that are watching, just know that we are very appreciative and applauding all that you do.
Thank you. And thanks for all that you do.
Thank you.